Going to talk to Douglas Murray, Associate Editor of The Spectator and the best-selling author of The War on the West. Douglas, let's start in China, where people are risking their lives protesting against government, and they're still instituting COVID zero policies, including mass lockdowns and quarantine camps. These are the biggest protests in China since Tiananmen Square back in 1989. And Douglas, it takes rare courage to protest against a communist regime.
It certainly does, Rita. This is an extraordinary sight. It's one that many of us had not expected. It's akin, of course, to the protests we discussed last week that are going on in Iran, where equally brave street protesters are protesting against a totalitarian government that has been trying to suppress them in different ways. The extraordinary thing about this wave of protests in China is not just that they're the largest protests for many years, but also, of course, that it might undermine one of the worrying expectations that some of us had. You see, many people thought that in the era of mass communication, there would be the sort of feeling in non-democratic countries that there was in, say, East Germany in the past. The East Germans saw how the West Germans lived. They saw American television, and they thought, why can't we live like that? And eventually they realized that they could. Now, China, that was the expectation about authoritarian regimes, that they would be able to dissolve and disintegrate because people in them would have access to information. The Chinese Communist Party has been unusually clever and indeed brutal in stopping its people getting access to information. So there was a fear that people like me had in recent years that the Chinese people would not be able to uprise ever against the CCP, precisely because they had information, but it was the wrong information or limited information. But here we see a genuine ground-up protest movement, and absolutely understandably so. Lockdown was brutal enough in Australia and in Britain and in America, but my goodness, the zero COVID policy in China, where millions of people are locked into tiny apartments in massive, massive cities like Shanghai. No wonder they eventually have a breaking point. I'm very glad that they're showing it.
Now, talking about China, Dr. Anthony Fauci is back in the news, and he's claiming that Trump's anti-China approach was the reason the Chinese Communist Party was secretive about COVID. This is what Fauci had to say.
What happens is that if you look at the anti-China approach that clearly the Trump administration had right from the very beginning, and the accusatory nature, the Chinese are going to flinch back and say, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to talk to you about it, which is not correct.
But they're not talking to the Biden administration about it either.
Exactly. I think that horse is out of the barn, and they're very suspicious of anybody trying to accuse them. We need to have an open dialogue with their scientists and our scientists, keep the politics out of it, and let the scientists, because these are scientists that we've known for decades, and we've collaborated with them.
We collaborated with them. Yeah, I think that was part of the problem. Now, how does this man even have a job, Douglas? I mean, and has he forgotten that China was arresting whistleblower doctors who were warning about a new virus in Wuhan before the world even knew COVID existed? And they were destroying lab samples. I mean, their secretive way of handling this had very little to do with the Trump administration.
Yes, I mean, you've put your finger on it, Rita. How do you have a dialogue with scientists who've been disappeared? How do you have a dialogue with the people who know how COVID emerged, but who were disappeared by the Chinese authorities, including, by the way, journalists, not just doctors, but journalists who looked into this question in China? I mean, Fauci, have you ever seen a man more pleased with himself, by the way, as an adjunct?
Gosh.
But I mean, even when the interviewer there says, but they're not talking to the Biden administration, he says exactly, as if this absolutely vindicates his point. But Fauci is just so desperate to make this entirely an issue of the Trump administration's lack of diplomacy. This had very little to do with that. The main problem and the questions about the source of the virus continue, and they continue because of the Chinese Communist Party's willful attempt to cover up and make sure the world doesn't find out what was happening in Wuhan. And I just don't think anyone should be deflected by this Fauci move or by anyone else. I'm very keen that the civilized world gets together and continues to demand a genuine answer to why this virus got out and how we'll make sure it never happens again. But I don't see that unanimity. I see people like Fauci saying, well, let's blame Trump, let's blame Biden, let's blame anyone but the Chinese Communist Party.
And we still don't even know where it came from. You know, that bat theory, whether it was from a lab, that is still not clear, which is remarkable given the impact it's had on the world for the last couple of years. Now, Douglas, on something entirely different, you wrote a piece for the New York Post arguing that the Republicans need to get behind Ukraine, and that's needed if Putin is to be defeated. But it must be said, many Republicans and indeed many Americans argue that Ukraine does not deserve any more American taxpayer money. Tell me in 90 seconds why they're wrong.
Well, first of all, you know, I just got back from Ukraine. I've seen the extraordinary effects that the Ukrainians have been able to achieve on the ground with weaponry given to them by allies outside the country. There's no doubt this has given them a strategic advantage they would not otherwise have had. So the arming of the Ukraine seems to me to be a very important issue. You know, if we don't want boots on the ground ourselves, arming our allies and friends should be the obvious next stage. But yes, I mean, there has always been a fear that this winter, one of the European allies would be pulled away by the Kremlin. You know, that gas prices, cost of living crisis, one of the European countries would effectively snap. I think there's also the possibility that could happen in the US. I'm just very keen that people realize that, you know, if we're going to stop tyrants like Vladimir Putin invading countries in the 21st century and getting away with it, the easiest and cheapest way to stop it happening is by arming the people who are defending themselves and their own country. We don't need to fight this. They're fighting it for themselves, but they need our support. And I very much hope that that line is held.